Thank you. Dr. Williams?
I'm going to echo that. I'm going to take what Jeff said just one step further. I'm going to say I would love it if 5 years from now I was hearing, or we were all hearing from students in Texas and in Arkansas and Mississippi that they were going to stay in a home state school, but they had to come to Louisiana because they were really so excited about service learning and how much service learning that was being done here in Louisiana. And so at McNeese, we'd love to spread that gospel to Texas.
Amen. Steve, do you want to see if we have any questions from our audience? Now, come on, they don't bite. Barbara Benson.
Thank you, Dr.
Star of our video.
Thank you for taking the risk and walking out on the ice.
Well, I think all the faculty here, at least, love doing service learning and want to be encouraged to do service learning. I want to hear from each of you what you see as a role that you can play in encouraging those faculty that do put themselves out there, because it takes a lot, and we get very little credit for it. So, you know, give me some input on what you could do at your university to encourage service learning.
I'll take that one.
Dr. Williams?
A couple of thoughts. One is those of us who are up here can take the lead in recognizing faculty when something wonderful is going on campus. I think that I feel it's an obligation of mine to make sure that I'm holding up great work from the faculty to not just folks inside the university, but to folks in the community and elsewhere. Just in terms of nuts and bolts, one idea that occurs to me is just in faculty evaluation. In the nuts and bolts of faculty evaluation, often I've seen systems where your teaching and your service and your scholarship or your research are looked at, but in that service area, sometimes that's broken down into service in the community and service in campus. But if we could give double credit for yeah, this is the McNeese crowd here. For projects that in fact do both. They work at the community level and they work internally. So I would be in favor of that. They're afraid to follow me. That's what I said.
Shall we move on to the next question?
I just want it known that it was the McNeese president, Nicholls folks,
Yes.
that offered the double credit. Okay, just to go.
When I first went to work at Southeastern, I had the privilege of working for 6 weeks under a man who had been there for 40 years. Now, let me tell you, he knew everything about Southeastern. And he had some pretty good ideas that he didn't get to fully implement, but he was director of institutional research, and I was hired to do that, and sadly a whole lot more. But he told me about a time when he conducted a survey of the faculty, asking them when they'd like to teach, when they'd prefer to teach. And he said they actually divided themselves into about 3 groups: the morning, the afternoon, and the evening, essentially, if they had their preference, that's when they would teach. Well, it's a reminder that in one way or the other, we're all different. And we talk about teaching, research, and service, and we know that very few people are astute and talented and skilled enough in all 3 of those to be at the top levels. But we do know that virtually everyone can be at that point in, say, one of those levels, at least one of those areas or functions within education. And so I think it's altogether fitting that we should take faculty as they are and make it clear that in our institution that teaching is par excellence. That's what we rely upon. But on the other hand, that we acknowledge the fact that faculty have talents in other areas, and those areas ought to be considered in the evaluation process, the annual reviews for promotion and tenure, and certainly service learning is an area that I feel should definitely be recognized and included in that, because it's really very important. And as a lady mentioned a while ago, it takes a great deal of time and effort. So I support this kind of thinking. I think we ought to encourage, again, in my opinion, we ought to encourage faculty to be facilitators and mentors of students.
I think from my background, again, I believe that in a teaching institution, that the basic criteria for evaluation has to be the quality of teaching. But then when you add to the mix in a maturing institution, research and service, both of them should be given equal weight and value so long as good teaching is the first criteria. You know, our history in higher education is not one of valuing service. We value research. Even look at our new formula, whatever it is, in the state of Louisiana. I wish somebody was here from the Regents to hear that, other than the chairman of my board. But you know, we need to put the role of a good teacher, a good individual in service, and a good person in scholarship. And you don't have to have all three. In my mind, you should be able to move up the ladder to promotion and tenure without all of that. But that's a conversation that really takes convincing many of your colleagues within the university that it's a different direction we're going in. Universities' presidents can stir the pot, but sometimes that's all that we manage to accomplish, a ripple in the pond. And a lot of people want it to return to a quiet state. I think that's a conversation that we should continue to have, to value service, and to value research in equal ways in support of what you're doing as a teaching faculty member.
Thank you. Steve?
I appreciate what you're saying and the approach to impact service learning and provide that to students. But as faculty members, and having been involved in a number of volunteer organizations, typically 20% of those members, if that, are active in the organization. The other 80% sit back and say, what are you doing for us? How, I guess, can those 80% hear it from upper administration, from the system, and say, you need to be involved in this without mandating it? I mean, encouraging is wonderful. I just challenge, you know, what else can be done and how can it be done? For us that are here, of that 20%, and there's others that weren't able to make it, to get the rest of 80% out there so we can have that impact. And being familiar with Mac McCarter's community renewal, it's a wonderful thing. And if it could be done throughout, yes, it would change this nation.
Well, if you get to be my age, you begin to realize nothing in higher education comes without a decade or two or more of transition, and it's unfortunate, but that's the reality. When we started with service learning with the Brown University Initiative decades ago, it was handfuls of people, and we basically collected people on campuses that already were doing this. They just didn't know that it had a definition to it. And over time, you know, to me, we've made progress. There are far greater numbers of people that are becoming involved. In part, it is some of you move up into positions of leadership in your academic departments. It's the expectation that you give to a new young faculty member that they will be involved in service learning and they will contribute back. And you know, these universities were created by you folks, and they're transitioned by you in terms of the strength of the academic programs and the outreach. It's your expectation, and that's probably a very general answer to what you want. But I think the numbers have grown considerably in terms of participation, and I think that's going to continue to happen. But it's also going to happen through a number of you moving into leadership positions and stating expectation. One of the problems we have in regional universities is that the generation of faculty members who have been there 30+ years are retiring. And now we have a new generation of PhDs and doctorates in education coming from research institutions, and their vision of what the institution is probably their home research institution where they earned their doctorate. And they need to learn what our teaching institution is about, and that comes from many of you.
You stated things well when you mentioned 20% versus 80%. Probably everyone in the room's familiar with the Pareto principle that tells us, for example, that 20% of the people will provide 80% of the productivity. But I usually think of that in a different way. I think of it in terms of, in any volunteer arrangement or organization, probably 20% of the people will do 80% of the work. So that tells us that there's a good likelihood that that 20% core is vital to any enterprise. But what it's also reminding us is, even in the case of private enterprise or certainly a university, when we talk about productivity or things of that nature, it's still a voluntary situation. You know, we can pay to have faculty in place, good faculty and staff in place working with our students, but they've got to volunteer their hearts and their minds and all of this kind of passion that we heard about this morning, that you've heard about during the day. That's really a voluntary arrangement. This is why typically at Northwestern we don't try to force people to do things they just particularly don't seemingly want to do. We would hope that we have enough heroes and heroines out there and that we acknowledge the great work that they do, that other people would want to be a part of that kind of situation. But for the most part, it's pretty well their choice. But we can still reward and encourage those kinds of behaviors that we feel are worthwhile for an organization, and in higher education, worthwhile for our faculty, staff, and students.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the president certainly can't mandate volunteerism. It's just it's counterproductive, I think. But what a president can do is let the community know, especially by holding up examples of terrific projects or behavior, things that are happening that are particularly positive, and saying how much you appreciate what is being done, and then letting folks know that the culture is one of rewarding that kind of volunteerism. And I really loved the ant analogy that we heard from Reverend McCarter at lunch. I think one does turn into two, two turns into four, and things, at some point there's a magical tipping point where the 2080 becomes a bandwagon and it's 80-20, and everybody, no one knows how it happened. So I think as long as we continue to support your good work, that good things happen over the long haul.